Life will find a way of pulling the rug out from under us. I'll support you in finding out who you really are. And I'll also support you in developing a deeper relationship or understanding around what it means to be human. And to be human in this time, in this place, in this culture. It's those hidden, shameful, repressed parts of ourselves that tend to cause our anxiety, our depression, our masking. Something happens particularly around midlife, where this inner child suddenly becomes more conscious, suddenly becomes more active in the psyche, but not in a way that we would recognize. This is the crux of being human right here. Okay, yeah. We're really getting into it. This is great. I love these conversations, Matt. I've got to say, I'm so happy to be here this morning. I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I'm really enjoying having the space to get into this stuff. There's nothing better for me. And this is what we see in the culture: is on a Friday or Saturday night in any city, the drinking culture and the fighting culture, knife crime. Okay, they're all extensions of that. So I often say that any force in the body it can be a force for good or ill. And one of the questions I would say is really important around that, and this is something that I've experienced, is when it happened for me, is I began to ask the question,
Hi, James. Welcome to the show today. Let's start just by learning a bit about you, I guess. Give me some context. What do I need to know?
Well, first of all, Matt, thank you for inviting me on. It's good to be here. It's good to see you. Good question. I would say that I came to the work that I do and to the life that I live now from a slightly different, the road less traveled, I often call it, from a lot of people. So I would say that I grew up feeling very much like an outsider, like something was missing. And really at quite a young age, I was curious about what else was out there. So even from quite a young age, I was curious about what's this being human really about? And that drew me to have some different, interesting, inspiring experiences as a young man, which led me to the work that I do now. And I'm sure we're going to dive into that in a lot more detail in the next half hour.
Yeah. I mean, maybe tell me a little bit about what the work is that you do, and then I'd love to hear about some of these experiences.
Okay, great. I was thinking about this before we came on. My elevator pitch when people say, "What do you do?" is I say I'm a therapeutic coach. So I support people using a mixture of coaching and therapeutic practices and interventions. But what I love discussing and getting into these conversations about is that really there's a lot more to it than that. I don't like the term therapist or coach, but that's the baseline. Is I use different practices from those traditions to support others.
It's what people understand, don't they? You can say it and people understand the premise of what you do.
Absolutely. Well, we all need a label, right? We all need a label to understand, and that's the label. Yeah.
So tell me some of the experiences that you had that led you down this journey.
It's funny, Matt. As part of my work now, one of the things that I talk about is the genius myth. Have you come across this idea? This concept? Okay. So it's actually a book by a guy called Michael Meade. Wonderful guy, mythographer, storyteller, very involved in men's work. A sort of pioneer of men's work in the 70s and 80s. And he tells this wonderful story that the word genius, which we all know in our culture, and we take it to mean, what does genius mean to you? If I say genius, Matt, what does a genius mean to you? What would you say?
Oh, I mean, an absolute expert in their field, that they know way more than anyone else, and they just seem to have this natural ability to supersede anyone else.
Excellent. Fantastic. I would say culturally that's bang on the money for how we perceive a genius to be or conceive of a genius. But actually, one thing that I really love in my work and just in my life is language and how language has evolved, how we use language, right? So interestingly, the word genius originally comes from, it's closer to a North African word, which is the root of genie, which is sort of like the spirit that we all have. So the genie in the lamp. Yeah.
Yep.
And this idea of the genie or the spirit is that we all have a genie. We might call it in our culture soul or spirit or something. And what Michael Meade says is actually the word genius is more closely rooted in something like this essence or quality that everybody has. Not just an expert or a specialist, but a unique quality that every human being is born into the village with. And actually, it's the role of the village to tease out what that quality is so that that person can grow into that and then gift that back to the village or the community.
Okay. Yeah.
So this idea is that actually we all come into the world and we all have some kind of genius. It's just tapping into it, right?
Yep.
Now, the reason I'm bringing, stay with me here, the reason I'm bringing it up is that I realize now that I'm getting onto these experiences that I had. From quite a young man, I always felt like I was an outsider and I was drawn to different things. And I realize now looking back that that was kind of my genie at work. That was my kind of essence. But I was in a culture where none of that was recognized. So I just felt like a complete outsider. The experiences that I'm going to get onto they came about as a result of that deep curiosity and that real sense of wanting to find out more about what it means to be human and to find out who I really was. So at 19, I packed a bag and I left for India. And that's not completely unusual in our culture. It was more unusual then in the mid-90s, but still. And that started a 5-year kind of odyssey of living, traveling around the world. But a lot of that time was spent in India. And, I've got many stories from that time, but I spent a year living with sadhus, which is the kind of Indian tradition, the monastic tradition, the kind of spiritual teachers or elders of that tradition. I spent a year living with 3 sadhus in the mountains in India. I was barely into my 20s. And that year really set the foundation for the way that I work now, almost 30 years on. So that's one, entry-level example of what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing you say it because I know lots of people feel that they're a bit of an outsider. I mean, obviously here in the UK, that the classic famous TV show, The In-Betweeners, and I think one of the reasons it was so popular and connected so well is many of us could almost see ourselves in it, that we weren't the cool kid, but we weren't there. But in fact, lots of us were even further out on that we feel that we didn't fit into that generic mold, I guess, that whether that's just culture, whether it's the school system, whatever it is, that we all follow this same path. And what you're saying is actually we've all got that genius and we need to nurture it out of people. And that's why, you see it in the creative industries, I guess. Someone's a fantastic musician, but they were terrible academically. So it looked like they were failing during their teen years, but actually that wasn't their thing.
Yeah, very much so. And you mentioned 2 important concepts in that, which is the culture and the education that we grow up in. Yeah. So the reason those experiences in my 20s were so kind of definitive was because what I began to experience was that there was another way of being. There's another way of understanding and exploring what it means to be human, other than what I'd experienced in those first 18, 19 years of my life. And I think what we have to be really aware of is that we have a very narrow bandwidth in our culture of exploring or giving permission around what it means to be human. And the problem with that, the education system is a great example. I don't want to go into a big thing about that. I think probably most of your viewers are aware of the drawbacks, the challenges of the education system. But one of the things with that is that we don't elicit this genius, this essence of the individual. And I lived in traditional cultures in various places where I saw firsthand what happens where there's a village culture. And what I mean by village culture is a real thriving community. And that within that, there was this sort of acceptance of everyone in the village. Martin Prechtel is another wonderful American teacher. He spent time with people in Mexico, Central America, and had similar experiences to myself. And I was inspired by him latterly after I came back, reading his books. And he said, in the village in sort of southern Mexico where he was, there's everyone there. There's the teacher, there's the elder, there's the drunk, there's the mad person, there's the mother, there's the warrior, there's the academic, you could say, or the learned one. But the important thing is that everyone was accepted, and he made this real distinction. Something that I saw as well is that I'll give you another example. So one of the communities I lived in, a remote, wasn't even a village, but a remote community in way up in the Himalayas near the Tibetan border. And what was interesting is there was a guy that lived there in a house on his own, and he would probably to us be neurodivergent, probably autistic, probably experiencing something like schizophrenia or bipolar. And the attitude that the people had to him was wonderful. It was very accepting and very inclusive. And they would joke with him about it. They would make jokes about it, but in a way that was inclusive. So he would kind of end up laughing at himself, and they would sort of, take the mickey out of each other. And what I noticed up there was that there was this wonderful acceptance and this wonderful kind of, more than acceptance, this kind of celebration of all the people in the village, whoever they were. So, that's kind of what I'm getting to in terms of, that's what we need to, I think, regenerate or rediscover in the culture here.
Do you think there's two parts to that? There's firstly that cultural, what we expect and what we accept, but equally for ourselves as individuals. You said there, that guy, they were almost making jokes and having fun, and he was laughing at it because he'd accepted himself. Whereas a lot of people, I think, we feel awkward because we won't accept who we are. We want to fit in. Whereas actually we'd be better accepting ourselves and knowing that actually we've all got flaws and we've all got benefits.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's actually a really good kind of segue into where I was going to go or wanted to go with the call. So it's like you knew, Matt. It's great. But boy, we didn't set this up, right? This is all online. So look, when I'm working with people, I always start by saying, because people often say, how do you work? And I'll say, look, I'm not a regular therapist. I'm not a regular coach. I'll talk a little bit about how I work. But the two things that I often say is that really, if you want to work with me, I'll support you in finding out who you really are. And I'll also support you in developing a deeper relationship or understanding around what it means to be human. And to be human in this time, in this place, in this culture.
Yeah.
But the first one is what you just brought up. Coming to understand and get to know who we really are. And, this is something that is a journey, and it's an exploration where we need to go off the map in our culture. There is no textbook, there's no blueprint for finding who we really are. I mean, these days we live in much more permissive times. There's a lot more out there to do that. But even now, where we're exposed to all manner of kind of personal development practices, it's still a real art to find out who we really are. Yeah. And I think it starts, a quote that I really like around this, that I use a lot, is Carl Jung said, we have two choices. We can choose to be good or we can choose to be whole. Have you ever heard that one?
Okay, yes, I have.
So we have two choices. We can choose to be good or we can choose to be whole. And the reason I think it's so important is that certainly our education system is based on the premise that we need to be good.
Yeah.
And culturally, often most of us were brought up in a family or a community where the emphasis is you need to be good. And as soon as you make a decision, I'm going to be a good boy or a good girl, you instantly disconnect from or repress the parts of yourself that are bad.
Yep.
So a lot of people come into adulthood And I've been working as a therapeutic coach for 10 years now. And one thing I've noticed is that a lot of us come to adulthood with this kind of hangover of needing to be good, needing to be a certain kind of person, which requires having this mask of like, this is the good Matt, and this is the good James. It's very unconscious. And actually, exploring and connecting and developing a relationship with those parts of ourselves that there's probably some shame around is really vital to reconnecting with who we are.
I guess we learn a lot of that at quite a young age. You were saying, again, we won't, go into the education too much, but it's very, I guess, common that you are rewarded for good behavior, punished for anything that steps outside of that, sitting quietly, listening, getting the right answer. That's the key one. And we must learn how to behave to get rewarded and get praised and get told we're a good boy or a good girl.
Absolutely. That's right. I mean, we all know that, right?
Yeah.
And I think what we forget is how deep that goes into the psyche and how deep it goes into our embodiment. Because then we develop, that becomes our strategy for life in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And it plays out in different ways. For some people, it might be, I'm going to stay right at the back. I'm going to hide behind everyone else and not say a word because that way I'm safe. For other people, it's going to make sure I'm at the front, getting in there first, because that way I know I'm safe. So the fascinating thing about that is then whatever's been kind of repressed or whatever's been swept under the carpet, that's the thing that then it's still there, it's still in the system. We then need to come back into a relationship with that and heal that relationship in order to be whole. And until we do that, my understanding from working with people for over 10 years is that it's those hidden, shameful, repressed parts of ourselves that tend to cause our anxiety, our depression, our masking.
I was about to ask, what are the downsides of that learning to be a good boy or a good girl? And you're saying that it develops in later life to cause some of these issues.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the process that I work with people is that whatever you want to call it, there is this young part of us. Sometimes it's referred to as the inner child in therapy.
Yeah.
Or the little one, whatever you want to call it. It's now my experience, having worked with a lot of people, that, I mean, everyone I've ever worked with, and therefore, I can assume that applies to pretty much everyone, has this young part of themselves that is still carrying all those feelings and those judgments and those experiences. And that what seems to happen is that something happens particularly around midlife, where this part of us, he's called it the inner child just for ease, where this inner child suddenly becomes more conscious, suddenly becomes more active in the psyche, but not in a way that we would recognize. And what I've observed, and there's definitely some literature and theory on this as well, but I like to base my work more on my experience than theory. It's way more powerful, I think. What I've noticed from my experience is that this little part of us that's carrying often some really deep emotional wounding, usually some pain, some sadness, some fear, and we could refer to that as early life trauma as well, is that this begins to play out, and it tends to play out and is experienced in our beings as most typically anxiety, depression, emotional outbursts, so uncontrollable anger or rage, and that until we heal and come back into relationship with this part of us, that's what will keep playing out.
Do you think there's something in there? You said about hitting that sort of midlife period. I mean, I'm 45 now, and I've certainly had those feelings, and I've spoken to a couple of other people, my dad included, that you get to this sort of age, and prior to this, you were always working towards something, school, uni, learning your first jobs, relationships, kids, maybe for some people. And then you get to this age and you're like, oh, so is this it? You know, you thought you were working towards something, and then you look around and you think, this is sort of my life for the near future. I don't know what the next thing is. And you almost feel a little bit lost. I often joke that I'm too old to be a young person, but I'm too young to be an old person. You know, I'm sort of in this middle. I don't know what group I fit into.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the crux of being human right here. Okay.
Yeah.
We're really getting into it. This is great. I love these conversations, Matt. I've got to say, I'm so happy to be here this morning. I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I'm really enjoying having the space to get into this stuff. There's nothing better for me. Look, another thing that really struck me about my time with traditional cultures was that each of the traditional cultures that I lived in had some kind of process or culture of initiation or rite of passage. And they've realized that particularly for men, look, let's be straight about it. And this has been my experience as well, of myself and working with others, is that we like and we want to stay boys as long as possible because it's much more enjoyable and it's much easier. Yeah. Being a boy is a lot of fun, not necessarily for some people's lives, but typically being a boy is fun, right? We get to do what we want to do when we want to do it. We don't have to think about other people. It's kind of about us. It's about me. It's about my enjoyment, my pleasure. And as kids, we have to allow children to go through. That's a vital part of any child development, is exploring the world, discovering what's pleasurable, what's not. It's all very egocentric. If we're still doing that when we're 50, culturally, that's a problem. And I would say that is what's happening in our culture. Now, traditional cultures recognize that men need some kind of initiation or rite of passage. So they don't stay boys, so that they can become men. They can become healthy men who can then be the elders and the leaders and the community leaders of that culture. So it really struck me that they had practices that would ensure that the boys would become men. Now, in cultures that don't have that like ours, what we tend to have is a lot of boys walking around in men's bodies.
Yeah.
Right? And we're left to figure it out on our own with no kind of guidance, no elders to support that. We're just kind of muddling through. And if we're fortunate, we will allow the things that happen in life to stimulate some kind of change for the better. We'll realize that life's asking us to grow up, and we'll do the growing up. But for the most part, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, that is it's true. I mean, you've often heard it, haven't you, of adult men, and whether it's their partners or when are they going to grow up? And I've often joked that men, we get older, we don't grow up, and that's probably a joke based on well, it is a joke actually based on real life experience and seeing how what it's like when me and some of my friends, we get together and we clearly think we're still 20 with the banter and fit, but we're not. We're real adults.
Yeah. And I think that the thing about this that was really life-changing for me is that the process that's really necessary for this, because as we've established, none of us want to do it. I think that's clear. Well, I'll speak for myself. I certainly didn't want to do it. It was I was fortunate in that in my work, I've realized that typically the time when this comes online for men is early 40s to mid 50s. There's a sort of 10-year window when something shifts in the psyche. It's like a kind of awakening, and we start to do exactly the thing you just mentioned, Matt. We start looking around going, wait a minute, is this it? I've got the job or the work, and maybe I'm married, and maybe I've got kids. But is there something more to life? And of course there is. Of course, being human, there's a lot more to life. And so an important part of this, as I understand it, and this is one of the things that I was really keen to talk about today, is that when I'm working with someone or when we're talking about this idea of what it means to become human, What's this process of growing up, of becoming really human? There's two processes at work. One is what I call this kind of ascendant process, which is kind of evolving, its personal growth and development. And that's vital, having some kind of physical practice. For some people, it's going to the gym and it's very physical.
Yeah.
For other people, it might be study, it could be academia, it could be becoming an expert in a field. For someone else, it might become, being the best kind of father they can be, So there's this idea of developing and growing, which is vital. But we're aware of that in our culture. I don't think I even need to speak to that. I'm sure you've had many people on the show that have talked about that. But the thing that's often missing, that's an important part of the mythic approach to being human and mythic stories, is there's also this descendant process, this requirement to go down. And it's something that we're fearful of and, really something that we really don't want to acknowledge in our culture, is that life will find a way of pulling the rug out from under us. We're going to meet these challenges that typically happen in midlife. This is a critical part of the midlife shift. And what is that? Often it's a death of a loved one, an ending of a relationship, divorce, being made redundant, losing a job. And in our culture, we tend to see these things as a problem, as negative things. And let's face it, they're not fun, right?
No.
But what I've learned, and I saw this firsthand when I was quite young in my 20s, but then I came to experience in my own life, which I can maybe talk about if there's time, and certainly working with others, is that these ruptures, they're the things that cause us for the first time to begin to look down and to begin this process of going down into the underworld as it is in mythic stories. And this is where we really connect to a deeper part of ourselves. And I often say to my clients, these are the things that we don't want to face, that we don't want to acknowledge, but they somehow cause us to face ourselves in a different way. That causes us to come into relationship with who we really are, that we would never have done if we were carrying on doing our yoga every day and our meditation and eating our healthy food and doing all the good things.
Okay, yeah. So those things are sort of sent to challenge us, because you're right. People around, our sort of age, it's our parents are getting older and, life is stressful. Certainly if you've got kids and a house and a job and, you see relationships break up, you see, jobs change and so much changes. And a lot of people, I think, go, he's having a midlife crisis. That's a term we often hear. Do you think that is slightly linked to all of that as well? Or is it just the freedom that sometimes the midlife allows us? Maybe we're if you haven't had one of those, maybe you're financially better off. Maybe you're trying to, I don't know, grab hold of trying to stay young. Like you say, you have that classic buying a sports car and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's all part of the same thing. And I think we're getting into this territory of, as I said a few minutes ago, of understanding what it really means to be human. And a prerequisite for that is, I would say, heartbrokenness. And this is probably something that isn't a big topic in these kind of conversations. It's not the kind of sexy approach to personal development or whatever, right? We love talking about the particular yoga practice or whatever it might be. We love talking about the new meditation practice. We love talking about the new diet because we get to feel good. We tend to, or we want to feel younger. Yeah, there's all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I would say that what does the world need? What is the world asking of us? So now we're getting into this kind of mythic territory. Not what do I want for my life? How can I live my best life? But what does the world need from me? What does the world need from us? And I would say that one of the things that's missing is in a culture that wants to stay young and relevant and good looking and healthy, what we don't get is the kind of grizzled, slightly contrary, life roughed up elder who has been really into the underworld, has really been through the ruptures of life, has experienced heartbrokenness, and in doing that has a different way of understanding what it means to be human, but also has a different way of being able to show up for the people in the village and realize that life is an act of service ultimately. That all the time we're trying to stay young and relevant, we're never going to come into a relationship with. So in my experience, it takes profound heartbrokenness to create this shift, to begin to think about what is beyond me. And one of the questions I would say is really important around that, and this is something that I've experienced, is when it happened for me, is I began to ask the question, what do I want to endure after me? What do I want my kids and my community to be experiencing when I'll be long gone by then? But what service what can I be in service to that's going to support that in 7 generations' time, not just in one?
Okay. Yeah, that sort of understanding of not what can I get is what can I give, I guess, back to your community. And that often comes through some sort of hardship. And often we said, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or, that going through some of that hardship, does that awaken that idea of there's more to life and what is being a human?
Absolutely. I think until we come up against that, it's very, very unusual to have that awareness.
Okay. Is there a way that we can develop that awareness prior to that, or do you just think it's a natural thing that we all have to experience?
That is a great question, Matt. That really is a great question. No, I don't think. I think we can develop compassion. We can develop empathy. We can develop a deeper relationship with each other and with the planet and with the time we're in. But there seems to be something necessary about this idea of having some kind of hardship or rupture that really creates a shift in that direction. So it's a very good question, and I wouldn't pretend for a minute to have the answer to it, right? But my sense is that, and actually, what comes up as I think about it now is it depends on the individual. But I would certainly say, look, it's really important to talk from self-experience, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes that's all we've got. What I would say from my experience is that I know for the first half of my life, I was the kind of man that the world probably didn't need any more of. I was fairly self-centered, didn't really think too much about other people, was on the take. What can I get out of life? How can I live my best life? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that I don't think I would have changed that course unless something had happened to pull the rug out from under me. And it's my perception that for most of us mortals, that's the case. But I've met some unusual individuals who seem to have had a kind of, they seem to have been born with something that they've always kind of lived in that way. So I don't think it's completely impossible, but I think it's unusual. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think a lot of it is based around the way we're brought up and, just that the culture that we live in means that we do need those wake up calls? I mean, one of the, I'm a parent, and one of my roles, I almost feel, is to make my kids' life as easy as possible, to protect them, to give them the best. And the problem is, by doing that, and I'm guilty of doing it, I know that there's going to be times when they're like, well, I don't know how to deal with this, and it is going to be phone mum, phone dad.
Yeah, absolutely. It's 100% cultural. I think there's an element of human nature in it. We're an organism like any other organism. Yeah. We want to perpetuate, we want, right, you get all that. So there's some self-interest there. But it's very much a part of the dominant Western culture Where one of my teachers, a man called Stephen Jenkinson, says, we live in a death-phobic culture.
Yeah.
We have this profound fear of not just death, but endings.
Yeah.
So what happens? So we have this health and safety culture that we have. We have this very protective way of parenting. And by the way, I'm also a parent. And for all, I can sit and talk about this all day long. When it comes to parenting, I'm the same as all the rest of us in our culture. I have that instinct and that desire to protect my kids, and I probably do that to a fault. But the point is, it's absolutely cultural. And I think that it's really important that we begin to start having more discussions around how can we open up a different kind of experience and relationship to risk, to endings, and to death itself.
Yeah, I've had discussions around death with someone on this podcast who'd been through it, and one of the things, they're almost a grief specialist because they very quickly learned that one, they weren't prepared for it, and secondly, no one really knows what to say when you've got a friend who's lost someone or a relative. Because we just don't talk about it, and in fact, it's because even thinking about losing a loved one is a little bit icky. So it's okay, no, putting that to the back. I'm not gonna do it. But actually understanding that this is life. It's gonna happen to all of us.
Yeah, absolutely right. And again, we're getting onto something really, really important that I've discovered from my experience, teachers that I've worked with, and now in my practice, is I bring this into the conversation quite regularly. You're going to die. I'm going to die. And we have an opportunity in our relationship to death in those around us to begin to practice it in a different way. Because the way which we approach death ourselves becomes, in some ways, a kind of teaching for the people in the village around us. It becomes a way of saying to others, this is how death can be. And the really critical thing about that is that fear, when it's not acknowledged, fear when it's not processed and metabolized, turns into something really dangerous. It turns into this desire to kind of contract, to kind of want to be safe, and eventually to kind of stop really living life and stop being really alive. We kind of end up dying before our time because we're not in relationship to that. So the irony is, by confronting that fear around endings and death, my experience personally and with others is we tend to become more alive. And so that's something that I would want for us going forward as a people.
Yeah, just thinking about it now, that sort of acceptance that you are going to die and the world is going to carry on and there's still going to be other people about. It sort of puts you in perspective that we're not really that much of a big deal. And I don't mean that harshly to anyone, but in the grand scheme, however important you think you are, if you die, the world's not going to implode. It's going to carry on. And I think by understanding that, you can maybe then go, okay, I should just live my life and enjoy it more because at one point I am going to die. And when I say people are going to forget about you, I don't mean that harshly. Obviously, you don't forget about your family members. You deal with it, but time goes on, things carry on.
Yeah, absolutely right. And this perspective is a significant shift, particularly around the midlife time, when we go through this radical change, really. It's a significant shift in terms of how we look at the world, how we look at ourselves, how we're willing to celebrate life, and how we're able to then look at what are we doing here and what do we want to do with the time we have left.
Do you think this affects men slightly more than women?
The simple answer to that is yes. Now, I don't think there's a difference in the kind of idea of death phobia. I think that's throughout the culture.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a kind of difference in that. One thing I would say is that I do think the ego is stronger typically in men.
Mm.
And so when we're confronting the idea of our own demise or endings, it's the ego that experiences that. So that's why I think it's more significant for men.
Yeah, I've sort of spoken to a couple of people about this recently and listened to other podcasts, and maybe some of that is cultural as well, because we've had some massive shifts in the last sort of 20 years in equality, and it's all been positive things, but we see a lot of men still have that built-in ego, big, got to be the provider, got to do this, got to be the man, and actually culturally that doesn't need to be the case, but we're struggling to accept some of that and accept maybe our own, I guess, vulnerability that exists here on the planet.
Yes, that's a really good point. And we're getting into something that I think is also really important. And this is now kind of rocky terrain, right? The idea of genders.
Yeah.
And my take on it is that, look, as men and women, we're wired up differently for good reason. And we can take that back to basic science and biology. So as we've evolved, men have needed to be a certain way and women have needed to be a certain way. And as I see it, and I may be quite unpopular for saying this, but hey, this is my experience, right?
Yeah.
Is that what's happened now is we're experiencing a loss of identity around gender. And I don't want to get into how men are supposed to be or women are supposed to be, but there are these kind of biological and probably psychological imperatives that have driven men and women. And now we've lost that sense of identity. There's a kind of a confusion around what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? And in kind of making everything as equitable as possible. Now, there's a lot of positives in that, without a doubt. But in trying to make it as equitable as possible, what we've done is we've lost a lot of that relationship to, what drives me as a man and potentially what drives a woman.
Mm.
And particularly for men, and I can speak more about that because I am one, what I've noticed is that there are certain traits of men that have kind of been demonized, which is a real concern to me. Now, I work with young men who've been in prison for a wonderful organization called A Band of Brothers. I don't know if you've come across
Yeah, heard of them. Yeah.
And we work with young men who've been in prison, and we do rites of passage and mentoring programs with them. And what I've realized is that for men growing up now, but even when I was, there's a sense of, how do I be a man in the world? And one of those things, and we work really, we really focus on this with young men, is working with anger and aggression.
Mm.
So as I understand it, and I'm not a kind of neuroscientist or a biologist, but my understanding of it is that we've evolved to necessarily be in relationship to aggression and anger, because typically we've been doing the hunting and the protecting for the village. So we have a certain way, so we've needed to be connected to that, a healthy kind of aggression. Because if you're hunting and if you're protecting the village, if you don't have a latent aggression, you're not going to do very well in either of those, right?
No.
There needs a certain kind of mobilization of the life force. So what happens now is men have been demonized for being angry or being aggressive. Now, in certain situations, absolutely. If men are aggressive or angry in certain situations, then that shouldn't be permitted, absolutely.
No.
But we're naturally like that. And what do we do with those instincts? We're not hunting anymore. We're not protecting the village anymore. And yet we're expected to kind of somehow now, and this is, I think, critical for working with men, is finding a way of channeling that into a healthy outlet. But that's just one example of how the culture's impacted negatively on certainly men. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've heard lots of talk, AI and changing jobs. And there was a comment made that actually when machinery started to come into the workforce, we didn't need men's strength in the same way. And actually the men who just worked by being stronger and bigger than other people, actually that was taken away because you had a machine to lift that stuff. So there's been some massive changes that, in fact, if you look at the workplace or whatever, some real benefits that women are able to get out into the workplace. Women are equally able to work any of the jobs, but for men, they lost some of their bits. So, and I'm not saying that women shouldn't have advanced, but we've got to look at the other side of this, of what changes have happened that are affecting men. Because in fact, the aggression that men have, if there isn't a good outlet for it, then actually that's detrimental to the entire society that we live in. Like you say,
Absolutely.
people end up in prison.
Absolutely right. And this is what we see in the culture, is on a Friday or Saturday night in any city, the drinking culture and the fighting culture, knife crime. Okay, they're all extensions of that. So I often say that any force in the body it can be a force for good or ill, right? And this is a really good example. So I love history, and I was reading just the other day about the transition from the agricultural-based culture, which we were up to about the 1600s, into more of the factory industrial culture. And men went, so in the early 1600s, 80% of the male workforce worked in agriculture. By the end of the century, it was something like 12 or 15%. So again, men typically would have worked in the fields doing something physical. Suddenly they were in factories. You fast forward a few hundred years with AI, and it's a similar thing. So what can men do with that energy? Well, the flip side of that is, and this is what I work with when I work with men, one of the first ports of call is find an embodiment practice for working with that. And it's not just an embodiment practice, because when we're talking about healthy aggression, we're talking about the life force energy. So as men, I think we have this responsibility to learn how to develop an embodiment practice. So for me, it was boxing. I started boxing in my late 30s. It was life-changing. It's how we approach sex and sexual practice. It's how we approach kind of emotional intelligence. So actually, it turns into how we can develop that energy in lots of different aspects of our life.
I mean, just one other thing that's literally come into my head is that actually there is that change you say about the aggression, and certainly that we have as young men. As we're getting into our 40s and into our 50s, we know that our testosterone levels drop as well. Do you think maybe that plays a part in being able to discover other parts of ourselves?
Oh, that's another great question. There's a few things there. I think that's absolutely integral to the shift that happens. So if you look at it neurochemically or neuroscientifically or whatever, the drop-off in testosterone is one lens that we can look at that through. And I think the reason that's important is that we're less reliable on our physical strength. And I say less reliable, we're simply not as strong anymore.
No.
And so we need to develop a different kind of potency. And what I noticed that was very interesting in the traditional cultures that I was in anyway, is that there was this kind of shift from physical potency to spiritual potency. So some of the elders that I spent time with, they were quite kind of, old, kind of wizened old, old guys, right? Skin and bone often.
Yeah.
But they had this presence. They had this way of being that it just commanded respect. The youngsters, the young men in the village, would instantly listen when they were speaking. And I was struck by that because I came from England, where old people are generally a similar shape and size, but typically kind of disrespected and had a different kind of aura about them. And what I noticed is that, yes, in answer to your question, that as this physical prowess diminishes, we develop, if we are able to work with the processes that are going on inside ourselves, a different kind of presence.
James, I've loved our conversation today. We've covered quite a bit. Just to finish off today, if something that we've spoken about has maybe, sparked a bit of curiosity in someone, what's a book that someone should read, or someone that should be followed on social media, or, looked up and reading their blog? What would you say would be the next step? What should someone do?
Wow. Okay. There's a lot of ways I can go here. I think I'm going to pick three if I can.
Yeah, go for it.
So the three people that have been the biggest inspirations for me, I'm just going to go with the people, because people can look up books and interviews and the rest of it.
Yeah.
The three biggest inspirations for me are a man called Stephen Jenkinson. If I'm going to pick a book, it would be Die Wise by Stephen. The second person would be a psychoanalyst, a Jungian psychoanalyst called James Hillman, who really pioneered a radical change in therapy and how we work with kind of therapeutic practice in the 70s. So James Hillman is really worth reading and listening to. And the last person I would say is a man called Michael Mead. And I mentioned Michael at the start of the podcast.
You did, yeah.
A wonderful storyteller, mythographer, and teacher. So they'd be my three people if you want to find a little bit more about what inspired me. Yeah.
James, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights. It's been a brilliant conversation, and I've loved having you on the show. So thank you once again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Matt. Take good care of yourself.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Balanced Ambition podcast. I genuinely hope the stories inspire you as much as they inspire me. If you found value in today's conversation, please share it with a friend. And remember, by subscribing, you won't miss an episode, and it would truly mean the world to me. Stay balanced, and I'll see you next time.